The apartment was small, really small. The kind of place where you could hear everything happening next door, where the walls were so thin that whispers traveled through them like they were meant to be shared. It sat right above a laundromat, on the corner of 8th Street, and every single day, from dawn until well past midnight, the building hummed with the sound of washing machines spinning and dryers tumbling. Most kids would have hated living there. The noise, the heat rising up through the floors in summer, the smell of detergent that never quite went away. But for young David, that tiny apartment was home. And honestly, he didn't know any different. His mom worked long hours at the hospital. She was a nurse, the kind who cared too much and gave too much of herself. She'd leave before the sun came up and often wouldn't get back until David was already in bed. His dad drove trucks for a living, which meant he was gone for days, sometimes weeks at a time. David got used to waving goodbye and not knowing exactly when he'd see his father again. Being alone didn't scare him, not really, but it did get lonely, really lonely. The TV only got 3 channels, and they were always fuzzy. He'd already read every book on the small shelf in his room twice. The kids in the building were either much older or much younger than him, so making friends was tough. Most afternoons, David would come home from school, make himself a peanut butter sandwich, and just sit by the window watching people walk by on the street below. That's when he noticed it. Sitting in the corner of their living room, covered with an old bedsheet, was this big, bulky thing. It had been there since they moved in, left behind by whoever lived there before. His mom had talked about getting rid of it, but somehow it just stayed. One rainy Tuesday, when the loneliness felt heavier than usual, David walked over and pulled off the sheet, a piano. It wasn't beautiful, not even close. The wood was scratched and faded. Several of the white keys had turned yellow and a few were chipped at the edges. When he pressed down on one of the keys, it stuck halfway. The sound that came out was dull and slightly off, like the piano itself was tired. One of the pedals at the bottom was completely broken, just hanging there uselessly. But to David, it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. He sat down on the wobbly bench and just stared at all those keys, black and white, lined up perfectly, waiting for someone to bring them to life. He had no idea what he was doing. He'd never taken a music lesson in his life. Didn't know the first thing about reading sheet music or proper hand position or any of that stuff. But he pressed a key, then another, then a few more. The sounds were random at first, just noise really. But there was something magical about it. The idea that he could create sound, that his fingers on those keys could make something happen. He started experimenting, trying different combinations, listening to how certain keys sounded good together while others clashed. Hours passed without him even noticing. From that day on, the piano became his best friend. Every day after school, he'd drop his backpack by the door and head straight to that corner. He started trying to copy songs he heard on the radio, working out the melodies one note at a time. It was slow and frustrating at first. He'd get a few notes right, then mess up and have to start over. But he kept at it. Something clicked in his brain. He realized he could hear a song once and figure out how to play it just by listening. It wasn't perfect, but he could get pretty close. The more he practiced, the better he got. His fingers started moving faster, finding the right keys without him having to think so hard about it. His mom noticed first. She came home one evening, exhausted from a double shift, and stopped dead in the doorway. David was playing a song she recognized from the radio, and even though the piano was out of tune, even though he hit a few wrong notes, she just stood there with tears in her eyes. "How long have you been playing?" she asked. "I don't know," David shrugged. "A few months, I guess." She walked over and hugged him tight. "Baby, you're really good." He didn't feel good. He felt like he was just messing around, teaching himself, making it up as he went along. But his mom saw something different. She saw potential. Money was tight. It was always tight. But she started putting aside a few dollars here and there, hiding it in a coffee can in the kitchen. She'd pick up extra shifts when she could, even though David could see how tired it made her. She never said what she was saving for, but David had a feeling. Then one Saturday morning, she told him to get dressed. They walked down the street to a building David had passed 100 times but never really looked at. It was old, with brick walls and narrow windows. His mom pressed a buzzer, and a minute later a door opened. An elderly woman stood there, probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She had kind eyes and hands that looked strong despite her age. "Mrs. Chen, this is my son David," his mom said, "the one I told you about." Mrs. Chen smiled and invited them in. Her apartment was filled with music. Not playing at that moment, but you could feel it in the air. There were pictures on the walls of her performing on stage, old posters from concerts, and in the center of the room sat the most beautiful piano David had ever seen. It was glossy black, perfectly maintained, and when Mrs. Chen played a few notes, the sound was pure and rich. "Your mother tells me you've been teaching yourself," Mrs. Chen said, gesturing for David to sit at her piano. "Yes, ma'am," David replied nervously. "Play something for me." His hands were shaking. He wasn't used to anyone listening, but he started playing the song he'd been working on all week. He messed up twice, had to stop and restart once, but he made it through. When he finished, Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to his mom. "He has a gift," she said simply. "A real gift. I can teach him properly, if you'll let me." His mom's eyes got watery again. "I don't have much money." "I'm not asking for much," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. "What I'm asking is that he shows up, works hard, and doesn't waste this talent." That's how it started. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, David would go to Mrs. Chen's apartment for lessons. She was tough, way tougher than he expected. She made him learn all the basics he'd skipped, made him practice scales until his fingers ached, corrected his posture, and taught him how to read music properly. But she also taught him something else. She taught him that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about feeling, about telling a story, about connecting with something deeper. Within a year, David was entering local competitions, small ones at first, held in school auditoriums and community centers. He'd get nervous, his hands sweating, before he played, but once his fingers touched the keys, everything else disappeared. He started winning. Not every time, but enough that people noticed. Other parents would come up to his mom after competitions, asking who his teacher was, how long he'd been playing. Local newspapers ran little stories about the kid from the laundromat building who was making a name for himself. By the time David turned 14, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He was going to be a concert pianist. He was going to play on the biggest stages in the world. He could see it so clearly in his mind, could imagine himself at Carnegie Hall, playing for thousands of people. Mrs. Chen believed in him. His mom believed in him. And most importantly, he believed in himself. The dream felt real, possible, right there within reach. He had no idea that life was about to change everything. The phone call came on a Tuesday night. David was 16, sitting at the kitchen table trying to finish his homework while mentally rehearsing for a competition that weekend. His mom was in the other room folding laundry, and the apartment was quiet except for the usual hum of the washing machines downstairs. When the phone rang, his mom answered it. David didn't pay much attention at first, but then he heard her voice change. It got soft and shaky, and she said, "What?" like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she said it again. "What? No, that can't be right." David looked up from his textbook. His mom was gripping the phone so tight her knuckles had turned white. Her face had gone completely pale. That's when his world fell apart. His father had been driving his usual route through Pennsylvania. It was late, past midnight, and according to the police report, he probably fell asleep at the wheel. The truck drifted into the other lane and hit a barrier. He died instantly. They said he didn't suffer, like that was supposed to make it better. The funeral was small. David sat in the front row wearing a suit that didn't fit right, borrowed from a neighbor's son. He didn't cry during the service. He felt numb, like he was watching everything happen to someone else. It wasn't until later, when he was alone in his room staring at the piano, that it really hit him. His dad would never hear him play at Carnegie Hall, would never see him make it. The grief was bad enough, but then came the bills. David's dad hadn't had much life insurance. What little there was barely covered the funeral costs. Turned out he owed money too. The truck payments, credit cards his mom didn't even know about, medical bills from a hospital visit years ago that somehow never got paid. The numbers were terrifying. His mom spread all the papers out on the kitchen table one night, and David watched her try to make sense of it all. She kept doing the math over and over, like maybe if she added it up enough times the answer would change. It didn't. She picked up even more shifts at the hospital, started working 6 days a week, sometimes 7. David would wake up and she'd already be gone. He'd go to bed and she still wouldn't be home. On her days off, she wasn't resting. She was exhausted and he could see it wearing her down. Then her back started hurting. Years of being on her feet all day, lifting patients, rushing from room to room. She'd come home and could barely stand up straight. She tried to hide it, but David noticed her wincing when she moved, noticed the pain medication on the bathroom counter. One night, he found her crying at the kitchen table. Not because of the pain, though that was bad enough, but because even with all those extra hours, they were falling behind. The rent was late. The electricity bill was past due. They were getting letters threatening to shut things off. David was 16 years old, and he realized something that made his stomach hurt. His dreams were a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. The next day, he went to the corner store and picked up an application. The manager knew his family, knew what had happened, and hired him on the spot. David started working after school, stocking shelves and loading delivery trucks in the back. The pay wasn't much, but it was something. He'd work from 3 in the afternoon until 9 at night, come home exhausted, eat whatever was in the fridge, and crash. On weekends, he worked double shifts, 8 in the morning until 6 at night, sometimes later. The piano started gathering dust. He missed his Tuesday lesson with Mrs. Chen, then his Thursday one. When she called to check on him, he told her he'd be back soon. But another week went by, then another. The competition he'd been preparing for came and went. He didn't go. Mrs. Chen showed up at his apartment one evening. She climbed those stairs, knocked on the door, and when David answered, she just looked at him. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. He could see the sadness in her eyes. "I can't pay you anymore," David said before she could speak. "I'm sorry, I know my mom was already paying less than she should have, and I can't." "I don't want your money," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "I never did. I want you to keep playing." "I don't have time." "Make time." "You don't understand." David felt his voice rising, all the frustration and fear and anger bubbling up. "We're barely keeping the lights on. My mom is killing herself working, and her back is getting worse. And if I don't help, we're going to lose everything. I don't get to think about piano right now. I don't get to think about Carnegie Hall or competitions or any of that. That stuff isn't real. This is real." Mrs. Chen stood there for a long moment, and David thought she might argue. Thought she might tell him he was making a mistake, that he was throwing away his gift. Part of him wanted her to argue, wanted someone to tell him there was another way. But she just nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. "But David, please don't give up completely, even if it's just 15 minutes a day. Please." He didn't make any promises. Weeks turned into months. David graduated high school, but just barely. His grades had slipped. He was too tired to focus in class, too stressed to care about homework that didn't seem to matter. What mattered was the paycheck. What mattered was keeping a roof over their heads. He started looking at community colleges. Not because he particularly wanted to go, but because his mom insisted he needed something beyond the stockroom. She didn't want this life for him, even though they both knew there weren't many options. He enrolled in business management classes. They were practical, boring but practical. While other kids his age were going to parties and football games, David was balancing work, school, and trying to keep his mom from working herself to death. The piano sat in the corner, silent. Sometimes he'd walk past it and remember how it felt to play. Remember the way his fingers would move across the keys, the way music could make everything else disappear. But those memories hurt more than they helped. so he tried not to think about them. He got better at the warehouse work, faster, more efficient. The managers noticed. By the time he was 19, they promoted him to shift supervisor. More responsibility, but more pay too. He dropped down to part-time classes, so he could work more hours. By 23, he was assistant manager. By 28, he was running the whole logistics department for their region. He was good at it, really good. Turned out the same focus and discipline he'd used for piano translated to business. He could see patterns, solve problems, organize chaos into something that made sense. He met a woman named Jennifer at a work conference. She was a teacher, sweet and understanding. She knew about his past, about the piano he used to play. She'd ask him about it sometimes, but he'd change the subject. That was a different life, a different version of himself that didn't exist anymore. They got married when he was 30, bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. They had 2 daughters, both beautiful, both healthy. He had a good job with benefits and a 401k. His mom was able to retire finally, and her back slowly got better with physical therapy he could now afford to pay for. By any reasonable measure, David had a successful life. Stable, secure, comfortable, but sometimes late at night when everyone else was asleep, he'd walk through his living room and look at the empty space against the wall, the space where a piano could go, and he'd feel this ache deep in his chest, this hollow feeling that wouldn't go away no matter how good his life looked on paper. He told himself he'd made the right choices, the only choices. He told himself that dreams were for people who could afford them, and he'd done what he had to do. He almost believed it. Almost. The envelope arrived at David's office on a Wednesday afternoon. It was thick, expensive-looking paper with his name printed in gold letters. He'd been at his desk going through spreadsheets when his assistant brought it in with a knowing smile. "Looks important," she said. David opened it carefully. Inside was an invitation to a charity gala hosted by Robert Harrington. The name alone made David sit up a little straighter. Harrington was one of those people you read about in business magazines. Real estate mogul, worth something like $400 million. The kind of money that was almost impossible to wrap your head around. The invitation explained that David's company had just secured a major contract with Harrington's Enterprises. This gala was apparently his way of celebrating and thanking the key people involved. Black tie, open bar, live music, held at Harrington's private estate outside the city. David's first instinct was to make an excuse not to go. These kinds of events made him uncomfortable.
He'd grown up in an apartment above a laundromat.
He still remembered what it felt like to wear borrowed clothes to his own father's funeral. Events like this with people who had more money than some small countries, they weren't his world. But his boss made it clear this wasn't optional.
Harrington specifically asked for you to be there, he said.
You led the team that landed this deal. You need to show up. So 2 weeks later, David found himself in a rented tuxedo, driving his 7-year-old sedan down a private road that seemed to go on forever. When the estate finally came into view, he actually said wow out loud, even though no one was there to hear it. The house looked like something from a movie. Not just big, but massive. Stone walls, tall columns, perfectly manicured gardens with fountains and statues. There were already dozens of cars parked out front. Most of them luxury brands David had only seen in commercials. He parked his car between a Mercedes and a Tesla, feeling slightly ridiculous, and headed toward the entrance. Inside was even more overwhelming. The floors were actual marble, so shiny he could see his reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high. There was art on the walls that David was pretty sure belonged in museums. Everything screamed money. Old money. The kind of wealth that got passed down through generations. People were everywhere, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than David's monthly mortgage payment. They held champagne glasses and laughed those polite laughs that rich people do at parties. David grabbed a glass of water from a passing waiter and tried to look like he belonged there. He made small talk with a few people from his company, nodded politely at some executives he recognized, and generally tried to stay invisible. That was the plan. Show up, put in an appearance, shake a few hands, then leave early and get back to his real life. Then he wandered down a hallway trying to find the bathroom and got lost. The house was like a maze, hallways branching off into more hallways, rooms leading to more rooms. He turned a corner and found himself in front of a set of double doors that were slightly open. Light spilled out into the hallway, and David heard something that made him stop. Music, but not the generic string quartet stuff that was playing in the main room. This was different. He pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside. It was a music room, an actual dedicated music room. The walls were lined with shelves holding vinyl records and what looked like rare instruments behind glass cases. There was incredible sound equipment, the kind serious musicians used, and in the center of the room, positioned perfectly beneath a domed skylight, sat the most beautiful piano David had ever seen. It was a Steinway grand piano. Black and glossy and absolutely perfect. Not a scratch on it, not a single key out of place. The kind of instrument he used to dream about playing when he was a kid, practicing on that beat-up upright above the laundromat. David walked toward it like he was in a trance. He didn't mean to. His feet just moved on their own. He stopped right in front of it and just stared. His fingers started twitching at his sides, unconsciously forming chord shapes he hadn't thought about in years. "Do you play?" The voice behind him was loud and booming. David spun around so fast he almost dropped his water glass. Robert Harrington stood in the doorway. He was tall, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and a suit that definitely wasn't rented. Behind him stood a small group of people, all holding champagne, all watching David with curious expressions. I'm sorry," David stammered. "I was just looking. I didn't mean to. I asked if you play." Harrington interrupted, walking into the room with the confidence of someone who owned everything he touched. "Which in this case he literally did. I used to," David said quietly. "A long time ago." Harrington's eyebrows went up. "Used to? What happened? Lose your fingers in an accident?" A few people in the group chuckled. David felt his face getting hot. "No, nothing like that. Life happened. I had to focus on other things." "Other things," Harrington repeated like he was tasting the words. "You mean like getting a real job? Making actual money?" "Something like that." Harrington walked closer, studying David like he was something interesting in a zoo. "Let me guess. You had dreams of being a concert pianist, right? Playing Carnegie Hall? All that romantic nonsense?" David's jaw tightened. The way Harrington said it with that mocking tone made something twist in his stomach. "I had goals, yeah," David said carefully. "But life doesn't always work out the way you plan." That's when Harrington laughed. A big loud laugh that echoed off the walls. He turned to his group of friends and gestured at David like he was the punchline to a joke. "Did you hear that?" Another dreamer who gave up. He was still laughing, and the people behind him joined in. "Life doesn't work out the way you plan. That's what people say when they fail. When they realize they didn't have what it takes." David felt anger rising in his chest. Real anger, the kind he hadn't felt in years. This man didn't know anything about him. Didn't know about his father dying. Didn't know about his mom working herself sick. Didn't know about all those nights David spent loading trucks instead of practicing. "With all due respect," David said, his voice harder now, "you don't know what you're talking about." Harrington's smile got wider. "Oh, I hit a nerve, good. Look, kid, I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm being honest. The world is full of people who had dreams. You know what separates the winners from the losers? Winners don't make excuses. They find a way." "I didn't make excuses," David shot back. "I made choices. There's a difference." "Is there?" Harrington crossed his arms. "Sounds like the same thing to me. You chose to give up. You chose the easy path. And now here you are, middle management in a logistics company, standing in my music room pretending you're something you're not." The words stung more than David wanted to admit, maybe because part of him wondered if they were true. "I may not have pursued music professionally," David heard himself say. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't real. That doesn't mean it didn't matter." "Then prove it," Harrington said suddenly. His eyes had this gleam in them, like he'd just thought of the best game ever. "You're standing right next to a $200,000 piano. Show us this dream of yours was worth anything at all. Play something." The room went completely silent. All eyes turned to David. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. He looked at the piano, then back at Harrington, then at all the people watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. They were expecting him to fail, expecting him to embarrass himself. It had been over 25 years since he'd performed for anyone. His fingers weren't practiced. He spent his days typing on keyboards and signing paperwork, not playing music. What if he sat down and couldn't remember? What if his hands didn't work the way they used to? But then David thought about something Mrs. Chen had told him when he was 14. She'd said that music wasn't something you could lose. It lived inside you, and even if you didn't use it, it was still there waiting. He thought about his mom, who'd sacrificed everything so he could have lessons. He thought about his dad, who never got to see him play at Carnegie Hall, but who'd been proud of him anyway. He thought about all those years he'd spent wondering what if. And he thought about this arrogant millionaire standing here, mocking dreams he knew nothing about. David walked slowly to the piano, pulled out the bench, sat down. His hands were shaking as he placed them on the keys. The room was so quiet he could hear people breathing. Harrington stood there with his arms crossed, that smug smile still on his face, waiting for David to prove him right. David closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then he started to play. The first notes came out wrong. David's fingers hit the keys too hard, and the sound that filled the room was harsh and clumsy. He heard someone in the crowd suppress a laugh. His hands were shaking so badly he had to lift them off the keys for a second, take another breath, and try again. This was a mistake. A huge mistake. What was he thinking? He hadn't played in over 2 decades. His fingers were stiff from years of typing reports and handling inventory sheets. This wasn't him anymore. That version of David, the kid who could lose himself in music, who could make a broken piano sound beautiful, that person was gone. He started to stand up, started to apologize, started to accept that Harrington was right, that he was just another dreamer who'd given up and didn't have what it took. But then something happened. His right hand, moving almost on its own, found a chord, just one chord. It was from a piece he used to practice with Mrs. Chen, something she'd made him play 1,000 times until he got it perfect. The sound of that single chord hit something deep in his chest, like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten existed. His left hand joined in. Then his right hand moved to the next chord, and the next, Chopin. Nocturne in E-flat major. He hadn't thought about this piece in years. Couldn't have told you the name if someone asked, but his fingers remembered. Muscle memory from all those hours of practice, all those afternoons in Mrs. Chen's apartment, all those competitions where he'd played until his hands ached. It was all still there, buried under years of responsibilities and forgotten dreams. The melody started to flow. Tentative at first, uncertain, like someone relearning how to walk after a long time. He hit a wrong note and winced, but he kept going. Then another mistake, but this time he didn't stop. He pushed through it, and then something shifted. The stiffness in his hands started to fade. The shaking stopped. His fingers found their rhythm, and suddenly David wasn't in that mansion anymore. He wasn't in a room full of rich people waiting for him to fail. He was 16 again, sitting in his tiny apartment, playing for no one but himself because it was the only thing that made him feel whole. He was at his father's funeral, wishing he could play something beautiful to say goodbye properly. He was lying awake at night in that warehouse, his back aching, wondering if he'd made the right choice giving everything up. He was holding his newborn daughter for the first time, feeling both overwhelming joy and that hollow ache of dreams deferred. Every emotion he'd buried for 25 years came pouring out through his fingers. The grief, the guilt, the quiet desperation of a life lived in compromise, the love for his family, the resentment at the world for forcing impossible choices. All of it flowed into the music. The piece grew stronger, more confident. His technique wasn't perfect. A real concert pianist would have noticed the flaws, the places where his timing was slightly off, the notes that didn't have the polish that comes from daily practice. But technique wasn't what mattered right now. What mattered was the raw, honest emotion pouring out of him. The music swelled, became urgent, almost angry. Then it softened, became tender like a lullaby. It asked questions it couldn't answer. It mourned things that couldn't be changed. It celebrated small victories and acknowledged deep losses. David wasn't performing anymore. He was confessing. This was everything he'd never been able to say out loud. Everything he'd kept locked inside so he could be the responsible one, the provider, the man who did what needed to be done. The piece was building toward its climax, and David felt tears on his cheeks, but he didn't stop to wipe them away. His hands moved faster, the music becoming more intense, and he poured every ounce of himself into it. Then, as the piece called for it, he brought it back down, soft again, gentle, accepting. The final notes came out almost as a whisper, a quiet acknowledgement that this was his life and maybe that was okay. Maybe there was beauty in the choices he'd made, even if they hurt. The last note hung in the air, fading slowly into silence. David kept his hands on the keys for a moment, his eyes still closed, not wanting to return to reality just yet. In this moment, suspended between the last note and whatever came next, he felt more like himself than he had in years. Then he opened his eyes and looked up. The room had changed completely. More people had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the music. Several of them had tears running down their faces. An older woman in an expensive dress was openly crying, her hand over her mouth. A man who'd been laughing earlier now stood frozen, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. David's eyes found Harrington. The millionaire wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't mocking. He stood completely still, his face pale, and David couldn't quite read his expression. It looked almost like pain. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched out, heavy with something David couldn't name. Then there was movement in the doorway. A woman pushed through the small crowd, and David's heart jumped. Jennifer, his wife. She must have arrived late. She stood there staring at him with her hand pressed against her chest, and her eyes were wide with something that looked like shock. They'd been married for 12 years. 12 years, and she'd never heard him play, never even knew this side of him existed. He'd told her about it, of course, mentioned it in passing like it was just a hobby he'd had as a kid. But he'd never shown her, never let her see what it meant to him. Looking at her face now, David realized she'd never really understood. Until this moment, Harrington was the first to move. He walked toward David slowly, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. When he reached the piano, he stopped and just looked at David for a long moment. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by something raw and real. That was her favorite piece, Harrington said quietly. His voice was completely different now, stripped of all its earlier bravado. My wife, she was a violinist. That was the last thing she played before she got too sick to hold her instrument. David felt his stomach drop. I'm sorry, I didn't. She died 2 years ago, Harrington continued like he hadn't heard. Cancer, and I haven't been able to listen to music since. Couldn't stand it. Every note reminded me of what I lost. I had all her instruments removed from the house. Stopped going to concerts, even stopped coming in this room. He paused, his jaw working like he was trying to find the right words. But tonight, when I heard you playing, I heard her. Not literally, but I felt her. For the first time since she died, I felt something other than empty. Harrington's voice cracked slightly. I was cruel to you earlier. I mocked something I didn't understand. And I'm sorry. He extended his hand. David stood up from the piano bench, his legs shaky, and took it. They shook hands, and David saw genuine respect in the older man's eyes. That wasn't a dead dream, Harrington said firmly. That was a dream that's been waiting. There's a difference. The words hit David like a physical thing. A dream that's been waiting. Not dead, not gone. Just waiting. Other people started moving forward. They wanted to talk to him, to tell him how much the music had affected them. Jennifer was there suddenly, wrapping her arms around him, and he could feel her trembling. Why didn't you ever tell me? She whispered. Why didn't you tell me you could do that? David didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, but it was too complicated to explain right now. How do you tell someone that you buried a part of yourself so deep, you almost convinced yourself it didn't exist, that you were afraid if you looked at it too closely, the grief of what you'd lost would overwhelm everything else? The party continued, but David barely noticed. People kept coming up to him, sharing their own stories. A man who'd wanted to be a writer but became a lawyer. A woman who'd dreamed of dancing but went into finance. They all had something they'd given up, some dream they'd deferred. And his playing had cracked something open in them too. Around midnight, as guests started leaving, David found himself back at the piano. Alone this time, he sat down and just let his fingers rest on the keys without pressing them. He'd come to this gala expecting nothing, maybe some boring small talk, some mediocre food, a chance to network. Instead, everything had changed. He'd played music for the first time in 25 years and remembered what it felt like to be whole. But now what? Tomorrow he'd go back to his office, back to his spreadsheets and logistics reports. He had a mortgage and kids in school and all the regular responsibilities of regular life. Nothing about his actual circumstances had changed except something had changed. Inside him, Some door had been opened that he didn't know how to close again, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to. David couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Jennifer slept beside him, and his mind kept replaying everything that had happened. His fingers kept twitching, remembering the feel of the keys, the way the music had flowed out of him like water from a broken dam. Around 3 a.m, he got up and walked downstairs to the living room. He stood in front of that empty space on the wall, the spot where a piano could go, and something inside him just broke open. Not in a bad way. More like something that had been locked up tight finally came loose. He'd spent 25 years telling himself that giving up music was the right choice, the necessary choice, the mature, responsible thing to do. And maybe it had been back then. His family needed him. His mom needed him. He did what he had to do, and he'd never regret that. But somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that letting go of music was the same as letting go of who he was. That the kid who played piano in that tiny apartment above the laundromat was gone forever, and all that was left was this shell of a person going through the motions of a life that looked good on paper, but felt hollow. Tonight proved that was a lie. That kid wasn't gone. He'd just been buried under years of responsibility and fear, and the exhaustion of survival, but he was still there, still alive, still waiting. The next morning at breakfast, David's daughters noticed something different about him. They were 12 and 9, and kids always pick up on things adults try to hide. "Dad, you're smiling weird," his younger daughter said, crunching her cereal. "Weird how?" David asked. "I don't know. Just different. Like you know a secret or something." Jennifer caught his eye across the table and smiled. She knew. She'd barely been able to stop talking about it on the drive home from the gala. She kept saying, "I can't believe you never told me, and you have to play again. And that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Later that day, David did something impulsive. Something he hadn't done in years. He left work early, told his assistant he had a personal appointment, and drove across town to the neighborhood where he grew up. The laundromat was still there, though it had a different name now. The apartment above it looked the same, maybe a little more worn down. He stood on the sidewalk looking up at the window of what used to be his room and felt this weird mix of nostalgia and sadness. Then he walked 2 blocks over to Mrs. Chen's building. Didn't know if she still lived there. She'd been in her 70s when she taught him, which would make her close to 100 now if she was even still alive. He almost didn't go in, almost convinced himself this was stupid, but then he pushed through the door and climbed the familiar stairs. When he knocked on her apartment door, he half expected no answer. But after a moment, he heard slow footsteps and the door opened. Mrs. Chen stood there, older and smaller than he remembered, but very much alive. She looked at him for a long moment with cloudy eyes, and then her face broke into the biggest smile. "David," she said simply, not a question, just his name like she'd been expecting him. "Hi, Mrs. Chen, I know it's been 26 years, she interrupted. 26 years since you stopped coming to lessons." They sat in her living room, and David told her everything. About his father dying, about the bills and the warehouse job and giving up music, about building a different life, a good life, but always feeling like something was missing, and then about last night, about playing again for the first time, about how it felt like coming home. Mrs. Chen listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that hit him hard. "I always knew you'd come back to it. Maybe not as a concert pianist. Maybe not at Carnegie Hall. But music doesn't let go of people like you. It waits. However long it takes, it waits." David felt his throat get tight. "I wasted so much time." "You lived your life," Mrs. Chen corrected gently. "You took care of your family. You did what love required. That's not waste. That's beautiful. But now maybe it's time to do both. To be responsible and to be yourself. They're not opposites, David. You just thought they were." He left her apartment with tears in his eyes and a clarity he hadn't felt in decades. The next week, David went to a piano store. It was a nice one, the kind that sold quality instruments. He walked through aisles of pianos, running his fingers over smooth wood, pressing keys, listening to tones. A salesman approached him, started his pitch, but David barely heard it. He found one. Not a Steinway like Harrington's, nothing that expensive. But it was beautiful and well made. And when he played a few notes, the sound was clean and true. He bought it that day. Didn't even negotiate the price. Just pulled out his credit card and said yes. When the delivery truck pulled up to his house 3 days later, his daughters came running out, confused and excited. "What is that?" "Dad, what is that?" "That's a piano," David said. "Come on, let's get it inside." They set it up in the living room, right in that empty space that had been waiting for years. His daughters immediately wanted to bang on the keys, and David let them. Jennifer stood in the doorway watching with this soft expression on her face. That evening, after dinner, David sat down at the piano for the first time in his own home. His daughters sat on either side of him on the bench, squeezed in tight. Jennifer pulled up a chair. "Play the thing from the party," his older daughter demanded. "Mom said it made everyone cry." "That's a pretty advanced piece," David said. "How about I start with something easier?" He taught them a simple melody, just a few notes, nothing complicated. His daughters' fingers were clumsy and kept hitting wrong keys, and they laughed when they messed up. It was chaotic and imperfect and absolutely perfect. Later, after the girls went to bed, David stayed at the piano. He played through some of the pieces he remembered from his youth. Some came back easily. Others he struggled with, had to work through slowly, relearning passages he'd once known by heart. He wasn't good, not like he used to be. His technique was rusty. His fingers stumbled. But he was playing. Actually playing. And for the first time in 25 years, he felt complete. Over the next few months, something unexpected happened. David started getting calls. Word had spread from the gala about the logistics manager who played Chopin like he was channeling something divine. A community center reached out, asking if he'd be interested in teaching piano to underprivileged kids. Low-income families who couldn't afford regular lessons. David thought about that. Thought about himself as a kid. How Mrs. Chen had given him lessons when his mom couldn't really pay. How music had saved him during the loneliest time of his life. He said yes. Every Saturday morning he'd go to the community center and teach. Kids from rough neighborhoods, kids from broken homes, kids who reminded him so much of himself it hurt. Some of them had talent, some of them didn't. But all of them needed something music could give them. A place to belong, a way to express things they couldn't say out loud. A dream to hold on to. His daughters asked him to teach them properly, not just the silly songs, but real music. So Tuesday and Thursday evenings became lesson time at the Rivera house. He was patient with them in a way he'd never been patient with anything work-related. When they got frustrated, he'd tell them about the broken piano above the laundromat, about learning to play on keys that stuck and pedals that didn't work. You don't need perfect circumstances, he'd tell them. You just need to care enough to keep trying. David kept his job. Still went to the office, still ran the logistics department, still did all the responsible adult things. But now there was music woven through his life like a thread he'd been missing. He'd practice early in the morning before work. Play for his family in the evenings. Teach on weekends. He never performed at Carnegie Hall. Never became a concert pianist. Never achieved the dream he'd had as a 14-year-old kid winning local competitions. But you know what? He didn't need to. Because late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, David would sit at his piano and play. And in those moments, with his fingers on the keys and music filling the room, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't that kid dreaming of stages and applause anymore. He was something better. He was a man who'd lost something precious, survived without it, and then found a way to bring it back into his life on his own terms. He was a father teaching his daughters that dreams don't have expiration dates. He was a teacher giving kids from tough backgrounds the same gift Mrs. Chen had given him. He was a husband who'd finally let his wife see all of who he was. And sometimes, on Saturday mornings at the community center, when one of his students would finally nail a difficult passage they'd been struggling with, and their face would light up with pure joy, David would think about Robert Harrington's words, a dream that's been waiting, not dead, not gone, just waiting for the right time to come back to life. And David Rivera, sitting at a piano in a community center in a neighborhood that reminded him of where he came from, surrounded by kids who needed hope more than they needed technique, finally understood what real success looked like. It looked like this, messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Just like the music,